Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all very much for being here with us today. I'm Devin Matizuru, Assistant Coordinator for Hawaii History Day. And on behalf of Hawaii Council for the Humanities, we are so excited that you could join us and be part of this unique speaker series, which is focused on looking at Filipino and Filipino American history, culture, and food. This series was inspired by the work we do with the Hawaii History Day program and from learning from the many teachers and students we work with from across Hawaii. We, we wanted to open a broader space for Filipino and Filipino American curriculum, exploring history, literature, photography, art, music, and food. And so in this third and final session of our workshop series, we will be looking at how Filipino food can connect us to shared history, culture, and identity. Before I introduce our speakers for today, I'd like to say a few thank yous. First, thank you to our co-sponsors, the Tinalot Filipino Education Advisory Council and the University of Hawaii College of Education, currently under the leadership of Dr. Nicole Reyes and Frank Jumawan. I'd also like to say thank you to um, the Filipino American Historical Society of Hawaii and its president, Clement Bautista. And thank you to Hawaii's Plantation Village under the leadership of Executive Director Diana Espinas. Thank you all for being a part of this workshop series and for supporting our work. I would also like to thank our staff on the call. We have our Executive Director, Aiko Yamashiro, Associate Executive Director, Rob Chang, and Robin Jones, and I think Liz Soto, who will be joining our workshop today. And lastly, I would like to thank all of you for being here, for being part of this workshop series with us. All right, so we're gonna have an exciting workshop. Couple of announcements for this Nakem series. We've created a Padlet with the presenter videos, PowerPoint presentations, and other resources. And the recording for today's session will be uploaded to the Padlet as well. You can also access our Padlet from our High Humanities website, and I will be putting the links to all three of those into the chat. And now, now we get to introducing our esteemed guest speakers for today's session. Shannon Cristobal, my supervisor, is the director of Hawaii History Day and K-12 programming at Hawaii Council for the Humanities. Shannon is a PhD student at the College of Education Department of Educational Foundations at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Shannon was born in Honolulu, Hawaii, and raised in beautiful Kalihi. Her work is interdisciplinary, and her research interests include critical food studies, memory history, oral history, decolonial pedagogy and praxis, ethnic studies, foodways pedagogy, Filipino American literature, and teacher education. I have to catch my breath after that one. She's a passionate Filipino scholar, educator, and advocate in the decolonial process who aims to strengthen and educate families, communities, and educational institutions in Hawaii. With us here, we also have Dr. Maharaj Raju Desai. Dr. Desai is an Indo-Pino American scholar, dancer, activist, and adventurer. He holds a Master's of Arts and a Bachelor's of Arts in Asian American Studies from San Francisco State University. He has received his PhD in the Department of Education, Department of Curriculum Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. His work is interdisciplinary, and his research interests include critical pedagogy, youth participatory action research, ethnic studies, mixed race studies, multicultural and multilingual education, teacher education, critical food studies, critical language pedagogy, and Philippine studies. And he's taught in schools for over 10 years and has worked with students ranging from 6th grade to the university level. He's taught in Honolulu, Hawaii, and San Francisco, California. So welcome to our two distinguished and esteemed guest speakers.
Thank you so much, Devin. That was an awesome introduction. I usually do the introduction, so this is it's very different being on the other side and being the speaker today. So thank you. I know how that can be. So, Raju, did you want sorry, unmute yourself. Sorry. Also, I am, let me introduce myself. I'm Shannon Cristobal, as Devin mentioned, and I will be co-presenter with Raju on Filipinos in Hawaii and Filipinos and Foodways in Hawaii. So let's get started. So we will go to slide 1. Raju?
All right, good afternoon, everybody. So our talk today is about engaging students through Filipino food, right? So first off, what is Filipino food? And I'm gonna start off with a quote from the late Doreen Fernandez, who was one of the lead scholars in the Philippines around food, particularly around Filipino food. So she stated that the Filipino kitchen reflects our food and our culture. Its location in a flexible space, not necessarily a separate room, quite often outdoors in yard, field, forest, or boat, reflects the Filipinos' attitude to house, backyard, street, community as flexible communal space without strict divisions, right? So this idea that we bring our food is so important in our culture that it's in every aspect of our lives. Wherever we go, we take it with us. And if you've been to the Philippines, or if you ever go to the Philippines, you'll see that food is available everywhere, right? Depending on how busy your barangay is, at all times of the day, right? We have a very deep relationship with our food, right? And a passion for food. In terms of Filipino food is as diverse as our archipelago, right? The Philippines is one of the most diverse places in terms of biodiversity, but also linguistic and cultural diversity. There are at least 7,107 islands. And it's arguable that there are at least that many recipes for adobo, if not more, right? There's no one way of making Filipino food, right? That being said, as Filipino food is gaining clout in American like trendy cuisine and on social media, right? There is a need to challenge appropriation, right? But there's also there's no single authenticity of Filipino food as well. So that's important, right? Filipino food is diverse. And with that, Filipino food, as it's gaining popularity among non-Filipinos in the US, right? Some of the narratives I hear on social media describing Filipino food, some are very interesting, some are also very problematic. So for us, when we talk about Filipino food, we want to say, first of all, it's complex. It's as complex as the archipelago. It cannot be simplified. It is multicultural, right? Even before it goes into diaspora, it is already multicultural because the Philippines is multicultural. It has been a melting pot and a point of intersection of all these different cultures and religions, etc., for centuries, right? Even prior to European arrival in the archipelago, it was already a place of a lot of mixing and a lot of intersections and a lot of interaction of different cultures. It's also a fusion, right? It's the OG fusion food. As fusion food is now becoming trendy, right? Filipino food has always been a fusion because the Philippines has been a place of a lot of mixing of different cultures, right? A lot of people passing through for trade, different migrations coming in, going out, etc. Also with this though, in terms of Filipino food, something that Filipino food has that I think, particularly in the diaspora, particularly in the US, that has not been often been valued, but is now getting value, is this idea of counterpoint of flavors, right? As you have chefs now and gastronomists looking at counterpoint, that's something that our lolas and lolos sa tuhod or sa talampakan, our great-great-great-grandparents were already doing, right? This idea of counterpoint, where you take two flavors that seemingly are in opposition, but you put them together, right? Like I think about this when I think about the multicultural food day, and my mom said, okay, I'll make some champorado to bring to your school. So I brought chocolate rice, but my family saw my grandma would put peanut butter in it. So it's peanut butter, chocolate, and rice. Sounds really yummy. I bring it to school, everyone's like, what is that? And then I have mine and I put dried fish on top. And everyone's like, ooh, you're gross, what is that? It's actually counterpoint. And that's something that chefs now are trying to emulate, right? In all these other cuisines. I was always taught that we didn't have a cuisine, we just had a food. But all these chefs are now trying to copy what our lolas and lolos were already doing, right? So just understanding that counterpoint is a big part of Filipino cuisine that the rest of the world is just catching up to. And again, I cannot say this enough, Filipino food is diverse. There are so many different ideas around what Filipino food is. I'm not going to lie, when I first moved to Hawaii, I experienced Filipino food culture shock because when I would go to a Filipino restaurant, I would recognize some foods, but the other foods I had never heard of before. And then the foods I expected to always see in a Filipino restaurant, I couldn't find, right? So understanding that even within the Philippines, there's diversity of cuisine. I think in the diaspora, oftentimes, particularly I've noticed, I'm not gonna lie, here in California, we have this essentialized notion of what Filipino food is. But Filipino food is incredibly diverse. And I think it's important to remember that. And also, like when we're trying to pass on recipes, in our families, it changes as we travel to other places. And Shannon's actually going to talk about that in terms of Filipino food in Hawaii.
Okay, so yeah, I am the other half of Raju. So Raju just mentioned that he had culture shock when he came to Hawaii. I had culture shock when I went to California. So I lived there for 10 years and we both were, discussing like, yeah, when I went to California, they didn't have sari-sari, they didn't have batsu, or they didn't call it that. They call it pork and squash or balintawak, So Raj, if you can go to the next slide, or not slide, but the animation. Yeah. So classic foods like pinakbet, or pork guisantes, pork and peas, adobo, and then sari-sari. But Filipino food in Hawaii is an amalgamation of Filipino food brought from the Philippines, like Raji mentioned, but to the sugar plantations across the state from Oahu, Maui, Kauai, Hawaii Island, and Molokai. And it was passed down, adapted with the ingredients that were available at that time. And this process is known as creolization or hybridity. So like when we were talking about like pork balatong, the balatong, or no, was it pork balatong? Yeah, pork balatong, right? The mungo beans were different because we were using the Japanese mungo beans versus the Philippine mungo beans. So yeah, those are the kind of adaptations that we were getting, we're doing. So if we can go to the specific Filipino dishes, I mentioned batsu, like they don't have that in California or anywhere else that I know, but only in Hawaii, or we call it batsu, pork and squash. And then balintawak, the stuffed pastry. And then there's names like for common Filipino dishes, like for us in Hawaii, we call it chicken papaya, but I know on the Mindanao they call it tinola, or in the Philippines, tinola. And all that also connects to what parts of the Philippines you come from. If you're Ilocano, Tagalog, Visayan, then there's banana lumpia, which is turon. Or for me, there's another one that my grandma used to make called banday banday, which is a banana fritter, but also called maruya, right? So those are like the things that like the differences of Filipino food from in the diaspora, and also that had to do a lot with the who came over from the Philippines as Sakata or Filipino workers, right, for the plantation. So that was mainly, they were recruited primarily from the Ilocos Norte, northern regions, Pangasinan, Abra, and I'm forgetting something. So Visayan, Ilocanos, am I missing something, Raju? Ilocanos, Tagalog, or not, hardly Tagalogs, but mainly Ilocanos and Visayans. Yeah. And so that's the difference in the dishes. We can go to the next slide. So why food? Okay, and so I was asked this because I've been studying foodways, or Filipino foodways, or food for the last 6 or 7 years. And this quote, "Tell me what you eat and I will tell you what you are." It's more than just a temporal or ephemeral, meaning temporary. Once you eat it, it's gone. Actually, the study of critical foodways argues otherwise and looks at the ways in which food is a text, narrative, poetry, etc. Food as memory, food as history through cultural production, food as trauma, food as healing and agency and survivance. If you can go to the next quote. And that's Dharma Banlon, food historian from the Bay, and my Professor Rod and his son, looking at food. Food has been a tool of self-expression, self-actualization, resistance, even accommodation and power for people that have been placed at the margins of society. So yeah, food is a tool. But also, if we can go to the next quote, I'm going to unpack this one. This quote I use as a center point for my research, and looking at food as a marvelously plastic kind of collective representation in its varied guises, context, and functions. Food can signal rank and rivalry, solidarity and community, identity or exclusion, and intimacy or distance. And I'll just give you one example of what I mean by identity or exclusion, meaning, or you know what, maybe give me intimacy or distance. An example of that is my grandma used to take me to the open market next to Kalakaua, and I felt it was really intimate to me because I would go there every Saturday, so I would hear, you know, the different fruits and vegetables, you know, kamatis, tabungao, you know, I would eat the different, what's it called? Oh my gosh, I'm losing my train of thought. Desserts, what is it? Oh my God. Kankanen. Oh my goodness, my mom would be like so angry at me. Kankanen, so different kankanens. But I also felt distant because I didn't speak the language, you know, fully. So I felt like an outsider also. So there was an insider-outsider kind of feeling when I did go to the open markets. And I wanted to belong, but I didn't fully understand. So that's what I mean by intimacy or distance. So yeah, food can take both sides. It could be moving it away just from like pleasure, you know, just pleasure and means of nostalgia, but actually going a little bit deeper than that. So that's why we're looking at food today as a text, as memory, history, trauma, and healing and agency. Okay, so let's go to the next slide.
Okay, so food as a text. As Shannon already mentioned, food can teach us all these different things: memory, history, trauma, healing and survivance, healing agency and survivance. How can you use food in your classroom? So I've used it in journals, and we're gonna do a little activity on the next slide looking at that. Also with poetry, we're gonna do something with that today, but also with history and also oral histories. Because looking at the history and trauma and healing, sometimes oral histories can be difficult and painful, right? And sometimes our families do not want to talk about certain things. Having food can actually sort of soften those walls that people put up. Whenever I have my students do oral histories, whether it's in ethnic studies, Asian American studies, or Philippine studies classes, I always tell them to do their interviews around food. Because that's when you can start to discuss trauma a little bit easier. And I think also culturally, right, we express love through food. We express comfort through food. So it's hard for somebody to relive or talk about trauma if they don't feel loved, right? And a lot of times for Filipinos, that's how we express it, right? My grandma, when I would come home, the first thing she would ask me is, kumain ka na? Did you eat? Right? Food was her way of showing love. I use food for analysis and arguments, and we'll look at some of that too. And I also use food to build and strengthen relationships. In fact, when I sent the flyer for this event today to some of my friends, a friend on Kauai said, "Oh, you're talking about food? Are you gonna put that picture when we cooked together on Kauai?" She's like, "I was just looking on my Instagram this morning and I came across it," right? And we were cooking together, and I was sharing family recipes with her, and she was talking story about growing up with her mom in California before she moved back home to Hawaii, and what she learned from her, and how like it strengthened our relationship. Even just this morning, talking, reminiscing, food came up, right? So using it to build and strengthen relations with your students and also with their families. When I was at Manoa, I was teaching a class called IP 360 at UH, Philippine Food, Music, and Ritual. And what we would do is we would first reflect on our memories of food, talk about our recipes that remind us of home, whatever that means, right? Whatever home means. And then we would actually bring in our recipes, tell our stories, and share a meal together. And it created a very different experience in our class. It wasn't just, oh, let's bring in our cultural foods and eat it. But the story, who cooks this, when, why, what does it mean, what's the history of this? And so we're gonna be using a Padlet. There's 5 different questions. Choose whichever one you want to answer. What is your first memory of food? What dish do you crave when you're sick? What is one food that you could eat every day and never get tired of? Is there a particular dish that comes to mind when you think of home? The last one, when you hear the words Filipino food or Filipino cuisine, what dishes come to mind? These prompts are actually from the Filipino Food Memory Journal I used to do using my IP360 class. There were a few more prompts with it to allow students to really sit and reflect on food. Because, you know, no matter what class I teach in Philippine studies, whether it's Philippine Society and Culture through Film, Filipino family, even Filipino language, I say, what does it mean to be Filipino? Food. What do you want to learn about this class? Food and recipes. I'm like, okay, well, this is Filipino family. We can bring food in there, but we're not talking about food the whole semester. So for this class, I love that it was about food. And I was like, okay, y'all want food, so we're gonna talk about food, but we're gonna go deep with it, okay? You wanna talk about chicken adobo? Okay, but we're gonna talk about how does chicken adobo taste like, how does resistance taste like chicken adobo, and why, right? So I'm gonna put this Padlet in the chat. If you could please log on, and then we'll take a couple minutes to see what your responses are.
Wow. Miso soup, chicken nilaga, arroz caldo, smell of frying. What's your favorite? What is your first memory of smelling of frying? What kind of frying? Like frying of fish, frying of like, there's like panday, but you know, like maluya, ramas pancit. Wow, pinakbet, bibingka. So yeah, bibingka. My dad's sitting me on his lap and feeding me diniguman and rice. Wow. Simon noodles. Balat ng paraya. Potato leaf salad. Ginataan. Mom shrimp curry. Oh my gosh, you guys are making me hungry. Kankanen. What kind of kankanen? There's so many versions. There's puto, there's tupig. I always thought that kankanen was just this one particular one that my mom made, but I learned while studying this that kankanen means all the like the desserts. So you have to kind of be specific, like which ones are you talking about? Yeah, I thought kankanen was just like the sticky rice version, like in the pan. But yeah, no, puto is considered a kankanen, you know, tupig.
A lot of people mention, or a few people mention being fed by hand. You know, when I did this activity in my class at Manoa, a few of my students mentioned their parents actually massaging the rice, right? And then feeding it to them. And it was like, so that this food is healthy and you're healthy. Right? I had like 3 students that mentioned it, and they were looking at each other and they're like, oh, your parents did that too? Oh, I thought it was just my parents. I thought it was just my parents. And then they found out it was actually something cultural, right? Not all Filipinos, again, there's no such thing as something that all Filipinos do because the Philippines is so diverse. But some of the things we think of as just happening in our family actually might not just be in our families alone. Okay.
Malunggay soup made with green squash and perfect green beans. Too big.
Nice. Now that we're all nice and hungry, Shannon's going to talk about food as memory.
Okay. In Annette Kuhn's memory text and memory work, performances of memory in and with visual aid, I am looking at the significance of the narrative in cultural memory, in the sense that not just of the continuously negotiated contents of shared collective memory or stories, but also the activity of recounting or retelling memory stories, both in private and public contexts. In other words, of performance memory. Then the question is, how may the past be reenacted in the present through performances of different kinds? And when I talk about performance, when it comes to food, I'm thinking about performance of memory, like to plant and grow a vegetable garden. Like, how do you do that? Like, how do you, not put too much water, or to know where to get the right ingredients for a particular dish, to go to this particular Filipino store to get that particular vinegar that you need for that adobo, or how long should I cook that meat before adding the vegetables, you know, you need to drain it or whatever, you know, like there's so many like different ways of performing memory. And then like how much patis did my grandmother use, or how do you eat with your hands when you can and when you cannot do that. So we're looking at memory in so many different ways when it comes to food, and it's more performative than just aside from text, you know, and narrative, and then also poetry, but actually performing it. So that's a little different take on memory. I've been working on. So I guess we can go to the next slide. Food as history. Ooh, okay, this is gonna be my take on food as history because it's the work that I'm doing. So food history teaches us how food was used as a colonizing agent from the U.S. colonial project in the Philippines. I'm looking at works by Arquiza. I don't have the book with me, but most striking. And let me grab that real quick. Sorry. His book, Taste of Control: Food and the Filipino Colonial Mentality Under the American Rule. So there's a book he wrote on this. And what is most striking from it is how the American education system deemed Filipino food ways as inferior to the superior American industrial food etiquette and hygiene. For example, first graders were taught that imported condensed milk had greater health benefits than Carabao milk. In the second grade, lessons on etiquette were stressed, such as eating slowly, sitting down while chewing, and chewing one's food thoroughly. Another example, there were lessons on hygiene and how to protect food from dirt and flies using clean individual cups and drinking water for proper digestion, or quiza. Basically, this domestic science curriculum is also known as home economics, which was central to the colonial project and its civilizing mission. According to Don Mabanlon, Filipino bodies were deemed racially inferior to American ones. So too were their native foods. The students were told to eat 3 meals a day, avoiding the traditional merienda or afternoon snack, to eat with forks and spoons instead of their hands, and to avoid crops inferior to American varieties. They were also taught that American food in the form of refined sugars, red meats, and highly processed foods were nutritionally superior. So this history, this colonizing history, this is just one piece of it. There's others also coming to Hawaiʻi, where food was used as a way to control Filipino workers on the plantation, and I won't go into that one right now, but yeah, there's more history about how food was used as a means to control power, and to take away one's culture, to take away one's language and way of knowing and being. So that's part of the history that it's history that needs to be known. So Roger, did you want to go to the next slide?
Yeah, it's not just history, but also trauma. So when I think about that colonial history and thinking about domestic science was an American colonial curriculum that was used to educate women in these colonial spaces, including Hawaii, right? And really reshaped and taught the native people how to eat, right? How to eat healthy. And I think about that, and I think about the industry that was used to colonize Hawaii and also bring Filipinos, right? The sugar industry. And then domestic science was like, look at these foods. These are better than your island foods, loaded with sugar as preservatives. And our communities now suffer from diabetes, right? The trauma within our food. Not just that, if you look at this image, I will get back to this image later. This image is not taking place in the Cordilleras in the Philippines. This image is actually from St. Louis, Missouri in 1904, right? The trauma. This is from the 1904 World's Fair, where over 1,000 Filipinos were brought to St. Louis, mainly Philippine scouts, but also many different Filipinos. Basically, it was PCC before there was a PCC. Right? It was the pre-PCC. It was a human zoo, and Filipinos were intentionally put on display in this trajectory of evolution from savage Igorot all the way up to colonized, more American-like Visayan and Tagalog, right? And it was placing different ethnic groups against one another, but also perpetuating white supremacy. And folks had to reenact things. And so they had, this Igorot community had to reenact the hunting and killing and eating of a dog. And that's where that idea of Filipinos eating dog enters mainstream American consciousness. And why I talk about this as trauma is because I feel like every Filipino American has heard this stereotype, right? I've heard it referenced. I never heard it so many times in my life as when I was living in Hawaii, right? It's a normalized joke, but we don't look at the history behind it. This anti-indigenous, right? White supremacist violence. And also ignoring the fact that, and the way it's used on the island in the Pacific, when actually dog is a viable source of protein historically for many parts of the world, including the entire Pacific, but it gets placed on Filipinos. And it's because of this colonial experience, right, that trauma. And it's not just this. Doreen Fernandez also says, wars are food driven. Since food supplies must be gathered and stored, meals must be prepared for troops, leaders must distribute and control food, the food of war must be in convenient and accessible form. Food can be a weapon, as when it is banned or kept from circulation, or when it is destroyed and made unavailable. Thinking about we express food as love. And oftentimes we send that food to our relatives. What do we send home to the Philippines in the balikbayan box? Spam, Vienna sausage, M&Ms, right? Yes, these things are non-perishable, they're easy to transport, but why are they easy to transport? They're military foods. They were the foods used to supply our colonizers. And they are now the foods we use to express love that also perpetuate diabetes, high blood pressure, and all these other health issues in our communities, right? Don Mabalan also says, from this young and impressionable age, children were taught that the American way was better and to abandon their primitive Filipino ways of knowing and being, right? These folks are not primitive. They are organized. They have a highly structured society. They have very complex set of rituals and beliefs and practices. Highly adept architectural skills to build rice terraces, to build homes that can withstand typhoons without a single nail, right? But they're described as primitive because of that domestic science curriculum that was about food, but also about teaching us that the American way is better. And again, that trauma. But when I also think about food and trauma, I think about food as a way, we hold the history of that trauma within our recipes, but we can also use food to sort of heal or get through that trauma. And I go back again to this mungo or balatong, right? I showed you that similar version that I made for my friend on Kauai. When Don Mabalan passed, also on Kauai, I flew out to be with her husband, right? And I saw this, and cooking this recipe with her husband in her honor was a way for us to kind of process our trauma and our pain and to share that with each other, and I posted this 3 years ago. Had I known that last Monday would be the last time I would see you, I would have missed my flight and enjoyed a few more moments of your company. It breaks my heart that we will never share a meal again. Tonight, my mungo was seasoned with memories of your stories and laughter. I modified my recipe using more American ingredients in honor of you. Right? So I think about food as trauma and what that can mean for our students too. But I tried to pick a recipe that was actually healthy because sometimes I feel like in our family, we do use food to help with trauma, but it's not those healthy foods. It's those boxed foods that are perpetuating diabetes, high blood pressure, etc. in our communities. I also think about food and trauma as a way to talk about things that you can't normally talk about. When I had to do an oral history of my grandmother, I had to talk about it with my mom and interview her as we were washing vegetables for sinigang. And that was the only way I could get her to actually answer the questions that I wanted to ask, that I was always afraid to ask. And so I came up with this poem. A little note, you will all have a chance to write into your own food poems shortly. So no pressure, but just letting you all know ahead of time. So this is my recipe for a lola. Ingredients: 7 children, 5 survived to adulthood, 1 abusive husband, a pinch of World War II, a dash of adultery, a cup full of ambition, one heart full of dreams, one shady ass neighbor. Procedure. Mix it all in the bowl and stir well. Fold in a black eye here and a bruise there. Separate for 2 years, estafa, until thoroughly beaten down by the system. Transfer into a new country, bring to a boil, and then reduce because you can't speak English. Set aside to cool off in the house, garnish with 12 grandchildren and 1 great-grandchild. So with my family, there are certain things I was told, you cannot repeat this. Okay, I'll answer these questions, but you can't repeat this. So I can't repeat it, but I can talk about this recipe, right? And that's my way of keeping that story and not forgetting the sacrifice and what she endured. And Shannon's gonna talk about food as healing.
Wow, I have to follow that. That's a, thank you, Raju. Food is healing. Oh my. Gosh, okay, where do I? So food, I'm just gonna go into food has been used as a colonizing tool, but it can also be a way to heal and to decolonize. We can look at reclaiming our Filipino food practices of growing, planting, family gardens to be sustainable and self-reliant, procuring the kampang economy, which is a communal exchange, giving and sharing with one another, a homemade bread for a bunch of cherry tomatoes, cooking methods to transfer valuable household and heritage knowledge, cooking with your grandma, cooking with your mom, and learning those recipes now while they're still with us. Connected to cultural production and preservation, you know, joy of eating together and storytelling and oral history, you know, kapwa, creating that connection, that Filipino way of being. And so for me, that one thing that I have left from my grandparents was cooking, was going to the farmer's market. They didn't tell me their stories from the Philippines to Hawaii. I'm not sure why. I never got to ask them. Was it trauma? Was it assimilation? I'll never know. But what they did pass down to me was what it was like to eat pork guisantes, or what, you know, my grandma cooking on a Saturday morning, banday banday. You know, I wrote a poem about it, and I was too excited to eat it. I burnt my mouth, you know, and I still remember that. And like, oh my gosh. And it's those things that connect us, and that's part of that memory, to reclaim that, to hold on to that, and to pass that on to the next generation. And so may it be in writing a poem or a recipe, cooking together, growing in a family garden or a community garden, you know, that's part of the healing. So I'm gonna go to the next slide. As food is agency and survivance. Oh wait, did we miss a slide or a quote? Sorry. Okay, yeah, it's okay. We can go to the next slide. Food is agency and survivance. And my focus, as Raji mentioned about women, you know, about the home economics ideal. So I'm looking at uplifting the stories of Filipino women and their social biographies through food. I look at the work of Paulo Freire's notion of praxis to encourage students to become social agents, developing their capacity to confront real world problems that face them and their communities. In addition, I look at Bell Hooks' holistic approach to liberatory teaching that does not simply seek to empower students, but also to place power with teachers to help them grow in that process. And so, Raji, can we show the quotes? And this is one quote that I was, cooking of our own food is one way of keeping our culture alive amid an ever-growing wave of influences from elsewhere. Cooking and eating food that makes sense to our culture, economy, and gastronomic sensibility can lead us to recognize our roots, find our true selves, and thus grow to greater heights. That's Amy Bessa and Romy Dorotan. And they have a restaurant in New York. Is it New York or New York, East Coast?
Brooklyn. Yeah.
Brooklyn. And they have a book, a cookbook called Memories of the Philippine Kitchen, and it's a really great book if you guys want to. It's not just a cookbook, but she has her family stories in that book. Lots of great history. And the next quote, Raju. Pursuing a pedagogy of discomfort while accepting an ethic of Commensurability is a promising means of transforming relationships between indigenous and non-indigenous peoples involved in resisting the current industrial food model. I'm not going to read all of it, but an example of agency and survivance is with your students or with yourself, with your families, is taking action to learn and document your own family history, to map where your family is from and trace their roots, and also to learn a family recipe and to prepare it with a family member. Not just preparing it by yourself, because when you're preparing it on your own, that's one thing. But when you're doing it with a family member, you're sharing that story, you're sharing that knowledge, which is really key. And to learn about the ingredients in your family's dishes, to either grow it or to learn where it came from. The saying goes, know history, know yourself. And also it's like, if you don't know your history, then you don't know yourself. So that's part of the looking at agency and survivance. Thank you, Raju. And my next slide is, before we go into our activity, we're going to look at, I wrote this poem well, a long time ago, because I didn't have time to write a new one for this session. But I wrote this when I was in doing my master's degree, and my daughter and I read this together. It's a repeat and response, a call and response poem. So I'm going to read the first 3 lines, and then if you read it with me, so your arch, you sound it out. So it's like, I'm gonna read it. Warming, simmering goodness, wafting smells cradling my soul. And then everyone goes, with one sip of her chicken marungai. Unscathed by modernity, untainted and untarnished, eloquently passed down. With one bite of her chicken marungai. Plucking tender leaves together, you and I, incandescent love. With one bowl of her chicken marungai. Jovial diasporic communities remember and reconnect. Taste of home achingly resonate. One pot of her chicken marungai. Thank you guys for participating in that. So next we're gonna go to our activity. Raju?
Yes, so you have 10 minutes to write a food poem. So we have a couple prompts. You don't have to follow these, but these are some options. Think of a few ingredients that you absolutely love or hate in your cooking, such as shoyu, patis, butter, or salt. Write a poem that uses each of these in some manner. Write a poem in the format of a recipe or grocery list. Write a poem titled, I Can't Stop Myself from Consuming a Blank. And the 4th option, write a poem dedicated to the home cooking that your family made. You don't even have to like your cooking, right? Because again, it's not always positive connotations that we have with food. They can be negative as well. We want to embrace and look at all of that. So we're gonna play 3 different songs. You'll have about 10 minutes. Are folks ready with their poems? That was about 10 minutes. So do some reactions or see some cams on. I see a couple faces. Welcome back. We're gonna do some breakouts and have you all share your poems with one another. So first off, what was it like sharing your poetry about food with other people?
Does anyone want to share how, you can put in the chat also, what was it like sharing your food poems? Kim, very personal. Yes, it was personal in our group too. Raju, did you want to go to the other prompts too?
Sure, I was just seeing if anyone else had anything they wanted to say. Like lots of memories in family, right? Like just hearing about other people's food and tastes. We really get to know something about everyone. Amalia's comment about having to restrain feelings about your Lola. I feel like food brings that up. right? When we start writing about food, all these memories come with it, which is why food is a great way to engage students and bring up all these associations.
Exactly.
And I think with oral histories, that's why to do it around food and have that be there, because I think of, and sorry for those of you like me who have PTSD from that horrid song, but food allows you to just let it go, right? And you release all these barriers that you're holding in. And I think particularly for Filipinos, right, we're taught, part of kapwa, there's positives and negatives with kapwa. Part of that is we keep things. We don't share certain things outside of the family. And for immigrant generations, you don't share the pain and trauma with your kids. You tell those success stories, right? The Manong generation, when they were in California, they showed those pictures swagged out in their zoot suits in front of someone else's car. Look, I made it. I don't want to talk about my struggles because we don't want to bring you down, but that's where we draw our strength from too. So it's good for us, but it also is good for the folks who are sharing these stories because it helps them see that there's value in those stories too. And there's value in immigrant stories, right? How often do our family members get to share their stories how often are their stories valued in the larger society here, in the dominant society? But they could be valued by us at the dinner table. And so that's something that's really important. And that's, I think, part of when Shan was talking about survivance and healing with food and sharing those recipes, building those gardens with your family members.
Can I ask? I know we have some students in the room. Marissa, would you be able to share just your thoughts on either sharing your poetry, your food poetry, or anything? Just want to give you the chance to share with us while you're here.
Sure. Do you want me to share my poem?
Sure, that would be awesome.
Okay. I wrote about lumpia because my mom makes the best lumpia, and I kind of compared it to, I use it as like a metaphor for life. So I'll read it right now. Why can't everything in life be like lumpia? Neatly rolled, tucked and sealed, free from bitterness, reliable in its purpose, enveloping you in its flavorful embrace. Mom's kitchen swirling with the melody of potatoes, pork, and shrimp. Cut the tomatoes, peel the potatoes, wash the bean sprouts. The pot sizzles with the first raindrops of filler.
Wow, that was awesome. You know, the funniest thing though, so your mom wrote a poem about lumpia too.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Patricia, you gotta. That's amazing. You guys have the same food. That's so beautiful. Oh my gosh.
So these food poems, right? You can learn from each other, but you also learn about each other. What did you learn about being Filipina, Filipino, Filipinx from doing this? Did anyone learn anything new or discover something about themselves through this process? And it's okay, we only had 10 minutes to write our poems, right? But when you do this in a class, the different stories and the different narratives that students bring up, it kind of enriches the story around, it complicates the narrative of what it means to be Filipino. And I think that's one of the main things we want to leave you with, is to complicate that. There's no one way of being Filipino, right? There never has been, although there was a big push to try to make this one hegemonic way of what Filipino is, but that's impossible. It's not rooted in reality. We also wanted to talk about some resources we have for you. Shannon has compiled an amazing list of Filipino and Filipino American resources. Do you want to talk about that?
Oh yes, I do. So Roger, if you could scroll across. So we have, from the 3 sessions that we've had, we have videos from Kim's talk, Hannah's talk, and then our 3rd talk. But we also have included on this Padlet Filipino American curriculum and presentations from what is that called? I can't see. Dr. Ellen Ray Cachola, she did a workshop for us about a year ago, and she put together this document with just tons of resources from videos, pre-colonial, colonial, um, and Hawaii and the Philippines. So yeah, take a look if you can click on that, so we can. Sorry, Raju.
Sure.
So you can see she put together. She took a lot of time to extracurricular dance and martial arts. These are links to these films and videos, colonial and decolonial literature.
Ooh.
Yeah, there's tons. High school. So she also broke it up to high school, middle school, and elementary. There's field trips. Yeah, middle school learning resources, children's, and then so this is just one. So as you can see, this is just one document on this huge Padlet, and so we also have we did a speaker series with Fossil, and that's Clement's presentation, his video, his slides. I mean, so take a look, please go to it. And then there's the Tinalak educational journal. This journal or this edition has articles from Raju on Kapwa, Dr. Jeff Aceto on Nakem pedagogy, Patricia's work on K through 12. It's just jam packed with amazing work by different scholars, Filipino American scholars, and this whole entire Padlet has just, if you look at it, the amount of writing and poetry, and there's also Liz Soto's poetry, Amalia Bueno's poetry in the poetry section. We have amazing Filipino American, Filipino writers, poets, scholars. So please utilize these resources because they have been brought together in one place. And so you can see how rich it is and how blessed that we have this to use. So please utilize this in your classrooms, with your families, with your communities. This is just an amazing amount of work that has gone into these different into this Padlet. So please go and share it far and wide. Raji, did you want to?